They say Sparta never surrendered. But history tells a darker story, a story of one man who did. His name has been whispered for over 2,000 years, Ephialtes, the man who betrayed King Leonidas in the 300 at Thermopylae. But who was he? And what could drive a Spartan, raised from birth to die for honor, to sell his king for silver? To find that answer, we must step into the burning sun of 480 BC, into a land built on blood, pride, and silence. Sparta was not like other Greek cities. It was a fortress without walls, a society where weakness was erased at birth. Children were torn from their mothers at 7 and thrown into the agoge, the brutal training that turned boys into warriors and obedience into religion. Every breath, every scar, every word was dedicated to one thing, Sparta. And yet, there was one man who walked away. One man who turned against everything Sparta stood for. His name was Ephialtes of Trachis, not a full Spartan, but a man born in the shadows of their greatness. He grew up hearing the songs of Spartan valor, dreaming of joining their ranks. But when he came of age, the truth hit him harder than a sword. His body was weak, deformed, unfit for battle, rejected. For a Spartan, rejection was death. For Ephialtes, it was something worse, humiliation. While Sparta's warriors marched north to meet the Persian army, Ephialtes was left behind. He watched from the hills as the king of kings, Xerxes, brought an army said to darken the sky. Hundreds of thousands of men, a storm of iron and fire sweeping across Greece. And at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, Leonidas and his 300 stood to stop it. The pass was death itself, cliffs on one side, the sea on the other. Only a handful of men could fight at once. It was the perfect place for Sparta's defiance. For 2 days, the Persians threw their might at the Greeks and broke like waves on rock. The Spartans did not yield. Their spears struck with precision, their shields locked like a living wall. Xerxes watched from his throne, furious. Every charge failed. Every arrow fell short. And the myth of Persian invincibility began to crack. Then, from the shadows, came a man. No one recorded his entrance. No historian described his face. But they remembered his name, Ephialtes. He came to Xerxes with a secret. He told the Persian king there was a hidden path, a mountain trail that twisted behind the Spartan line. A goat path known only to locals, unseen by the enemy. If Xerxes' soldiers took it, they could encircle the Greeks. The offer was simple. Ephialtes wanted gold, and perhaps something more, vengeance against a city that had denied him glory. Xerxes accepted. That night, under the glow of torches, 10,000 immortals, the elite Persian guard, followed Ephialtes up the mountain. They moved in silence, guided by a man who knew the stones beneath his feet like scars on his own body. At dawn, when the sun broke across the cliffs, the Persians appeared behind the Spartans. Leonidas turned, and he understood. They had been betrayed. The battle that followed was legend. Leonidas dismissed the allies, ordering only the Spartans and a few loyal Thespians to stay. They fought until their spears shattered, until their swords broke, until they stood with nothing but their hands. And when they fell surrounded. The pass of Thermopylae was lost, but their story became immortal. And what of Ephialtes? Herodotus, the father of history, wrote that he received gold from Xerxes, but also that he found no peace. Because when the Persians were finally driven out of Greece, the name Ephialtes became a curse. In Greek, it came to mean nightmare. The very sound of it was a wound to Spartan honor. But here is where the story twists. Because what if Ephialtes' betrayal was not as simple as gold? What if something else happened in those hills? Some ancient fragments, lost texts, fragments from Diodorus and Plutarch, hint at strange inconsistencies. They say Ephialtes may not have acted alone. that there were others who knew of the hidden path, scouts, local guides, even Greek allies. So why did history name only him? Was Ephialtes truly the betrayer, or was he the scapegoat? It's possible the Spartan elders, the Gerousia, needed someone to blame. Spartan law forbade failure. Thermopylae had ended in defeat. Leonidas was dead. And Sparta could not admit that one of its sacred kings had fallen through chance or strategy. So they created a villain, a traitor, a man who embodied everything Sparta despised: weakness, greed, fear. And the story of Ephialtes, the betrayer, was born. But if this is true, then the real story of Thermopylae is darker than we think. Because it wasn't just about glory or courage. It was about control, about the story Sparta wanted the world to remember. And the man who might have been a pawn became the symbol of betrayal for all eternity. After the flames of Thermopylae died down, the world changed. The name Sparta was sung in temples and painted on shields. But the name Ephialtes, it became poison. No one dared speak it aloud. In every corner of Greece, mothers whispered his name to scare their children. Sleep, or Ephialtes will come for you. That was how the legend of the nightmare began. Not as myth, but as a man. Yet, behind the smoke of memory, truth is never simple. The Persians marched south after Thermopylae, burning Athens to the ground. But Sparta and her allies would rise again. At Salamis, the Greek navy crushed Xerxes' fleet. At Plataea, they broke the Persian army once and for all. Greece was saved. And when the war ended, the Greeks remembered their heroes: Leonidas, Themistocles, Pausanias, but also their villains. Among the names of the fallen and the glorious, one shadow remained: Ephialtes. No one knew where he had gone. Some said he had fled with the Persians, crossing the Aegean to live in their courts as a guest of Xerxes. Others said he hid among the mountains of Thessaly, living like a hunted animal. But Herodotus wrote something different, something chilling. He wrote that Ephialtes returned home, returned to Trachis, the very place near Thermopylae where he had been born. Imagine that. The man who doomed the bravest warriors in Greece, walking the same paths as before, hearing the same people whisper behind his back. He lived under the same sun that once shone on Leonidas' broken shield. But Ephialtes did not live long. The Spartans placed a bounty on his head, a public reward for anyone who killed him. It was not about justice. It was vengeance dressed as honor. Sparta did not forget, and it never forgave. Years passed, and the world moved on. But one man did not forget that bounty. His name was Athenidas, a man of malice. No one remembers who Athenidas truly was: farmer, soldier, or mercenary. But one night, when he found Ephialtes sleeping near the hills of Anacyra, he drove a spear through his chest. And just like that, the betrayer was gone. Herodotus writes that the Spartans rewarded Athenidas for killing Ephialtes. But even that didn't erase the stain, because by then, Ephialtes was more than a man. He had become an idea, a story. But here's where the story begins to twist again, because ancient sources reveal something strange. They say two other men, Onetas and Phanagoras, were accused of the same betrayal. Local guides who might have shown the Persians the mountain path. Yet history forgot them. Their names faded. Only Ephialtes remained. Why? Because the Greeks needed one villain, one face to hate, one sinner to balance the heroism of Leonidas. Now, imagine Ephialtes in those final days, a man whose name was cursed, whose home turned against him. He must have heard the stories being told, that he had sold out Sparta for gold, that Leonidas cursed him with his dying breath. But what if he hadn't done it for gold at all? Some modern scholars and fragments from ancient commentaries suggest that Ephialtes didn't act out of greed, but revenge. He was a man rejected by Sparta's ideals, a malformed body in a world that worshiped perfection. a soul trained to fight, but denied the right to stand among soldiers. He wasn't just betraying Leonidas. He was betraying Sparta itself, the city that had branded him unworthy since birth. That, perhaps, was the wound that never healed. But history rarely belongs to the wounded. It belongs to the victors. And the victors of Greece needed Leonidas to be a god, a perfect symbol of sacrifice. So the story had to be clean, simple, heroic. One side of the coin gleamed with honor. The other was smeared with betrayal. Ephialtes became that other side, and his death, swift and silent, was not the end of his story. Centuries later, Greek writers began to revisit his tale. They used his name in poems, in tragedies, in philosophy. To them, Ephialtes meant the nightmare that comes in the dark. But some began to ask, what if the real nightmare was not him, but what Sparta had created? The city that demanded perfection at all costs. The system that discarded the weak. The culture that raised boys into weapons and called it virtue. Could it be that the real betrayal lay not in Ephialtes' act, but in Sparta's heart? Because the very society that built heroes like Leonidas also built monsters like Ephialtes, and then buried the truth beneath marble and myth. By the time Plutarch wrote of the Spartans centuries later, the name Ephialtes had already become legend. But hidden in his writings is a haunting line. He was one man hated by all men, and yet known by none. And that's the tragedy. We remember him as a traitor, but we have no voice of his own. No scrolls written by his hand. No words to explain himself. Just silence and the echo of the curse. The curse of a man whose shadow still haunts the meaning of loyalty. But history has one final twist left. Because in the ruins of ancient Greek texts, there lies evidence that Ephialtes' family was not erased, that his descendants lived on, hidden, even serving in later wars. Some even fought for Sparta, reclaiming their honor in secret. Imagine that irony, the bloodline of the most hated man in Greece, dying for the same state that condemned him. It's a cycle as old as war itself. Honor and betrayal, glory and shame, feeding each other forever. But perhaps the greatest mystery isn't about Ephialtes' death or his motives. It's what happened after, how his story was used. Because what if his betrayal became the seed of Sparta's downfall? In the years after Thermopylae, Sparta's power grew, and so did its arrogance. The fear of betrayal haunted its kings. Suspicion poisoned its councils. Trust became weakness. And centuries later, when Sparta finally fell to Thebes and then to Rome, the words of the oracle seemed to echo across time. Beware the shadow of your own strength. Was that shadow Ephialtes? Or was it the spirit of Sparta itself? History has a strange way of turning blood into myth. And nowhere is that more true than in the story of Ephialtes, the man who betrayed Sparta, who brought down Leonidas, and who, in doing so, changed how Greece remembered loyalty, courage, and sin itself. But his death was not the end. It was only the beginning of a legend. One that shaped the moral spine of the ancient world for centuries to come. After the Battle of Thermopylae, Greece rose in fury. Every city remembered the 300 Spartans and their sacrifice. Bards sang of their last stand, sculptors carved their glory into marble, and even Athens, Sparta's rival, bowed its head in respect. But beneath that admiration ran a single venomous thread, betrayal. Ephialtes became a name whispered in disgust, spat from mouths like poison. In Athenian plays, to be an Ephialtes meant to be a traitor to your people. Children were told, never be like him. And in time, the word itself changed. Ephialtes, once a name, became the Greek word for nightmare. That's right. The man who sold out the 300 gave his name to the terror that creeps into sleep. His betrayal burned so deep into Greek consciousness that even their dreams could not escape it. But why did this one betrayal wound Greece so deeply? After all, in war, betrayal is common. Cities switched sides. Generals defected. Soldiers fled. Yet Ephialtes' act struck something primal, something sacred. Because Thermopylae was not just a battle. It was a test of faith. Leonidas stood for everything the Greeks wanted to believe about themselves. Courage, sacrifice, unity against tyranny. His death turned that belief into a story, one that would echo for millennia. And every story of heroes needs its shadow. Ephialtes became that shadow. But history is rarely as simple as it wants to be. For centuries, philosophers and historians revisited the story, trying to make sense of it. Herodotus, writing less than a century after the battle, preserved the earliest account, a tale of greed and revenge. Ephialtes, he said, betrayed the Spartans for Persian gold. But Herodotus was writing for Greeks who had just survived the Persian invasions. They needed villains. Later thinkers began to question it. Plutarch, centuries later, hinted at deeper motives. He described Ephialtes as a man broken by rejection, a man consumed by resentment. He was no foreign spy, no mercenary. He was a Greek who felt abandoned by his own. And in that sense, Ephialtes wasn't just betraying Sparta. He was betraying a system that betrayed him first. To understand that, we must look at Sparta itself. Sparta was a city built on iron. Its boys were taken from mothers at age 7, raised in barracks, forged into soldiers. Weak infants were discarded at birth. Failure was not an option. It was a death sentence. If you were deformed, too slow, or too emotional, you were an outcast. And by some accounts, Ephialtes was all three. Some historians suggest he had a physical deformity, a crooked back or lameness that barred him from military service. In a society that worshipped perfect bodies and perfect discipline, that was a curse worse than poverty. To be Spartan and yet unworthy of the shield, that was to be nothing. So when the Persians came, offering gold and glory, perhaps it wasn't greed that moved him. Perhaps it was the dark satisfaction of finally being seen. Imagine the bitterness. Imagine watching men who once mocked you die for a city that never loved you. To the world, it was treachery. To him, it may have been justice. But the Greeks never forgave him. His story became a mirror, reflecting their fears of weakness, of betrayal from within. Every empire fears the traitor more than the enemy. Rome had Brutus. Judea had Judas. And Greece had Ephialtes. Over time, poets use his name not just as a warning, but as a lesson. They taught that even a single act of betrayal could undo generations of honor, that the weakest man could bring down the strongest king. The story of Thermopylae stopped being about numbers or strategy. It became a moral fable about loyalty, pride, and the thin line between vengeance and justice. But here's where history twists again, because centuries later, when scholars unearthed old Persian and Egyptian texts, they found fragments suggesting that Xerxes never trusted Ephialtes. One Persian document, translated from cuneiform, speaks of the Greek guide who delivered the mountain path, but calls him a coward despised even by the king. Xerxes, it seems, rewarded him, but briefly. Not long after, the Persian armies withdrew. Ephialtes' usefulness ended. Perhaps even the Persians scorned him as a traitor. There's an irony so sharp it cuts through time. He betrayed Sparta to find belonging, and found only exile from every side. When the Roman historians rediscovered the Greek past, they too wrote about Thermopylae. But they viewed Ephialtes differently. To them, he symbolized something philosophical, the fall of virtue. A man who could not master his bitterness, who let envy devour honor. For them, he was not evil by birth, but corrupted by desire. Proof that even in the most disciplined societies, moral decay begins from within. And the Romans, who feared their own decline, used his story as a mirror for themselves. They saw in him the warning of what happens when the pursuit of perfection breeds resentment. By the Byzantine era, the name Ephialtes had lost all historical meaning. It was now the word for nightmare. No one remembered his face, his home, or his voice, only the shiver his name brought. 1,000 years after his death, monks copied manuscripts describing Ephialtes as a demon that sits upon your chest as you sleep. The man had turned into a monster of the mind, a literal nightmare. And that transformation tells us everything about human history, how memory can twist truth into myth until we no longer remember the man, only the fear he represents. But perhaps the cruelest twist of all came with time itself. For centuries after, Sparta, the city of honor, of iron discipline, of Leonidas, began to crumble. Its population fell. Its armies weakened. Its ideals decayed. By the time of Alexander the Great, Sparta was a ghost of its former glory. And as it fell, many Greek philosophers began whispering that the curse of Thermopylae still hung over it, that the betrayal of Ephialtes was not just an act, but a prophecy. A prophecy that Sparta, built on pride and exclusion, would destroy itself not by enemies, but from within. The betrayal that began with one man would echo through generations, a lesson never learned, repeated again and again across the ages. Today, when we hear the name Ephialtes, we remember him only as the traitor. But maybe, just maybe, his story is deeper than that. Maybe he is the reflection of what happens when societies worship strength and scorn compassion. When loyalty is demanded, not earned. When glory leaves no space for humanity. Perhaps that was Sparta's true flaw, not its enemies, but its inability to forgive imperfection. And from that flaw came its doom. So when we think of Thermopylae, of Leonidas standing tall before death, remember this. The greatest dangers to any empire are not always at its gates. Sometimes they are born within its walls, in the hearts of those it casts aside. And long after the fires have faded, long after the monuments have turned to dust, those hearts still whisper, still haunt, still dream. Because betrayal, like a nightmare, never truly dies. It only waits, in the dark, to be remembered again. Story finished.